Hello and welcome to the Fat Tailed Thoughts podcast. I'm your co-host, Stephen Dickens, and I'm joined, as always, by Jared Klee. Hey, Jared, welcome
Hey,
to the
Stephen,
show.
how are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Tough week this week. We're going to dive into a delicate subject, so a little less effervescent this morning in my tone, I suppose.
And a little less banter for today's podcast.
Yeah, more serious subject. So just get us orientated here for the listeners, Jared. What are we talking about?
Focus today is financial warfare, and the backdrop for this, of course, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And to be clear, Stephen and I both, I mean, our hearts go out to the folks there. I have a lot of colleagues, work colleagues, that work there. Stephen has personal friends that are there and suffering and escaping and under the guise of war from Russia, invading an independent, free, democratic country. We are going to stay focused on the world of finance, fintech, money. That's where we focus. That is our competency. So please take this against the backdrop of the very real human suffering that's going on. We're going to focus on what is our expertise and how can we help explain what's going on. And in this case, the tools that are being used by the free world to help support Ukraine in their war against Russia and maintain their freedom and reestablish their full independence.
Yeah, tough topic. And as Jared says, our hearts and prayers and thoughts go out to everybody in Ukraine who's dealing with this. I've got some personal sort of connections over there, and some of the situations are horrible. And, I think there's enough opinions on the internet on some of the geopolitical issues that we don't need to contribute further to those here. What I think we can add some value around is some of the financial instruments and techniques and tools that are being used by the West to isolate Russia from the rest of the world. So I think that's where we're going to spend our time. So somber note and somber tone for today's podcast, which is a little different to how Jared and I normally goof around on this. But we've really got three things to talk about today. Lots of discussions around SWIFT. What is it? How does it work? Mechanics of it and its importance. How countries levy sanctions on other countries. And then a discussion around central bank reserves. A lot of these topics are relatively new to people around how countries keep their reserves and how that structure works. So we're going to spend some time there, and then finally to spend a little bit about what it means to wage a war from a multi-domain operations point of view, and how the sort of landscape is changing there. So, Jared, let's dive in here. Get us orientated. First topic, let's talk about SWIFT. Lots of discussion about this over the last 10 days or so. So just let's start at the top and go from there.
Well-deserved discussion. It's important one. It's playing a critical role. We do need to back up a second, because even though these topics are going to be new, if we go back to 2010, 2011, 2012, this is actually the second time on a truly global scale that the U.S. has led and with its allies a financial war against adversaries. So if we go back in time, we saw this against North Korea, we saw this against Iran, we saw this against Syria. And if you remember from a number of years ago, they were cut off from the global financial markets. They were cut off from global oil trade. We levied sanctions. The difference here is Russia is much, much, much bigger. This is an economy that's doing $1.5 trillion a year of stuff. It imports, exports, even though it's down over the past decades, still $250 billion worth of stuff every year. This is a massive interconnected economy that's truly part of the post-World War II globalization effort. What that means is
world's 11th largest economy by GDP, which was a factoid that I picked up over the weekend. So when you compare this against the countries that you just mentioned, North Korea, Syria, Iran, some of these other places where the US has leveraged. This is definitely on a scale and an order of magnitude that we've not seen before.
Absolutely. And that cuts both ways, Stephen. One, uh, Russia's ability to be self-sustaining, they're one of the largest wheat producers in the world, is much greater than many of these other countries. But the flip side is they're also far more dependent on the global economic order, on flows of trade, of flows of money than any of the other players. I've heard on a number of other podcasts and articles comparisons against Venezuela being cut off or the like. I mean, to put it in context, Venezuela is about a third the size of Russia economy wise. Most of that's oil. They import less than $5 billion worth of stuff a year. I mean, they are totally self-sufficient by design. They don't interact with the outside world. Russia, by contrast, is deeply, deeply integrated with the overall world. So what we're going to talk about here, the levers the US and its allies have to pull are far more impactful, but it also becomes far more complex because you're simply dealing with a much larger, much more interconnected player.
Yeah, and you look at I posted this morning about 200 companies that deal with Russia. Some of the amount of, and we talked about it before we started, the level of action and tracking that people are doing to sort of get under the skin of some of this. The amount of Western companies that have got huge operations in Russia, and the implications of that and the multidimensional natures of those trading relationships can't be overstated, I don't think.
The Economist just this morning ran numbers. There's $121 billion in bank loans outstanding to Russian banks. I mean, in the event that technically we already have a sovereign default from Russia, they're refusing to pay interest. But once the schedule actually hits, and it would not surprise me if we saw bank failures, that will reverberate around the world. And again, we're talking scale that we've simply never had before.
As we get towards month end and positions need to be closed out, it's going to be very, very interesting.
It will.
We're still intra-month, and a lot of these organizations kind of think on that type of time frame.
It will. So starting with SWIFT, and it's a really good place. When we talk interconnected, you kind of can't talk interconnected on global financial without talking SWIFT. So SWIFT is a really interesting organization based out of Belgium, jointly owned by the member banks. So technically a privately owned cooperative, not government owned. Nonetheless, it from time to time, governments globally will weigh in on SWIFT so that it effectively bends to their will. And what I mean by that is if you're member owned and your members are banks, well, those banks live in countries. And if the government tells the banks, hey, look, we're going to make your life very difficult unless you vote one way or the other at SWIFT, again, you can tend to bend it. But those have to be cases of effectively unanimity among the member banks. Otherwise, you're simply going to lose the vote. And we saw this back in 2014. The U.S. tried to weigh in on SWIFT in actually Crimea. The last time Russia decided to invade Ukraine, and SWIFT said, no, we're staying out. We're not staying involved, largely because Europe at that point didn't want to, in their view, escalate the situation. This time it's changed. So SWIFT, let's start with the basics, and then we'll walk forward to what does it mean for Russia or Russia member banks to be cut off from SWIFT. SWIFT is the messaging system for how money is sent around the world. And we need to be very clear here. Fundamentally, there are two different things that happen during payment. One is you send a bunch of messages. You make sure that's the right bank to be sent to. You make sure that's the right recipient. You make sure that the person who you're sending it to or that the bank that is facilitating it, that the money is moving through, is not on a sanctions list. There's a whole series of messages that are sent back and forth to validate that the payment can go through and will go through successfully. And other kind of useful details like what currency is it in. Separate from that, once you are comfortable that payment can be sent, each bank that's involved in the transaction then separately updates their ledger, meaning they keep track of within their bank, I owe this, and Stephen has this many dollars here, and Jared's got that many euros here. That actual updating of the ledger is separate from the message sending. That's within the bank's control. The message is jointly owned. Well, it turns out you can't stop people from sending money, but you can make it really, really, really painful. In theory, you could send these messages between banks you could send it over email, you could send it with an owl, you could send it with a pigeon. Like, it doesn't matter. But when you're moving trillions of dollars a day, you set up massive operations with hundreds of people and automated processes to go process all these messages and such. And when you cut off that main way of sending messages, it becomes really cumbersome to find another way to do it.
And I think that's the key point in this. You can't stop Bank A sending money to Bank B. If those two banks want to send money to each other, the US can have an opinion about, or the West can have an opinion about that, but fundamentally they can't stop it. What you're saying is there'll be applications and processes and systems built up within those two banks that leverage Swift and the messaging system that it represents in order to facilitate those transfers. So over the last 20 years, somebody will have built an application stack that says, here's the relative approvals within the bank, do this check, do that. They'll have built business logic on top of that Swift messaging layer at both banks. You remove the underlying messaging layer between those two banks, those application stacks become non-valid and don't really aren't fit for purpose because the fundamental layer's taken out. Now you've got to move probably to a paper-based and manual process because you're stepping away from those in-house built applications. As you said, you've not stopped it happening. You've just made it ridiculously difficult and hard to achieve.
It's like waking up one morning, if you live in LA or San Francisco or Seattle, and finding out that you can't fly to London. Instead, you got to take a boat, and you got to go all the way down around yeah, you can take a boat, but God, that's a terrible way of getting it done. And needless to say, the amount of flows, the number of people that travel from Seattle to London is dramatically going to fall because you've introduced so much friction into that process. Fundamentally, that's what Swift has done here. Swift, not everybody, but they've booted out the vast majority of the Russian banks, certainly all of the ones that are involved in primarily state-sponsored enterprise, which means that all of a sudden Russia has a whole bunch more friction in terms of sending money internationally, flows in and out. That is a major hurdle if you're trying to say, get trade done, your $250 billion a year of imports. It's really hard to do that business if you can't send the messages required to move the payment.
So obviously that's happened. We're starting to see deplatforming happen for some of the other payment rails as well. Barclays, MasterCard, Visa, American Express, PayPal, Apple Pay. So this sort of deplatforming of the Russian economy from a intra-bank transfer, but also from some of the individuals. You would have gone to the metro and scanned your Apple Pay to get your ticket. That platform's not working. I mean, really unprecedented, I think, set of instruments and techniques. Let's put it that way.
And Stephen, this second part largely comes when we talk financial warfare. It's never just one tool in the toolbox. It's how do you leverage multiple tools in concert so that the combination is more effective than the individual pieces. What we're seeing from Visa and MasterCard, what we're seeing from the exiting from a number of banks is largely a result of sanctions. So sanctions, different than Swift. Swift is saying, you simply can't send messages using our system anymore. Sanctions is the US and its allies saying, you are not allowed to do business with this entity, with this person anymore.
So let's just go back to Swift before we jump to sanctions, because sanctions is our next topic. There is a couple of alternatives. Russia, after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, developed their own system. Russia saw what happened as the threats, and China saw what the threats as well and has developed their own system. So if you can, talk through the alternatives to Swift. Once you're cut off, what are your options?
So for scale here, there are at least prior to Swift cutting off, there were 291 Russian banks hooked up to Swift. They sent about 600,000 messages a day. That's practically zero now. As you rightfully said, Russia developed its own internal system called the System for Transfer of Financial Messages. Swift, by the way, is an acronym. This is FSPS. Again, nice short acronym. It's not quite a Swift replacement. Let's be honest. It only works during business hours as opposed to 24/7. It's far more expensive to send messages. The only banks hooked up to it are within Russia's borders. They're limited to no external parties involved. It is a fairly clunky system. Nonetheless, prior to the Swift cutoff, it was handling about 20% of the total message volume that Russian banks were sending on any given day. So not insignificant, but to scale up 5x overnight to support the full load, I expect there will be real problems.
So that's how those 291 banks, that's how they're going
That's
to
how
be.
many were hooked up to Swift. There are a number more that are just domestic and would have gone through intermediaries. But that's
Yes.
how they will still be able to send money internally. They've also got a hookup. And again, the public news on this is a fair bit lower. There's not a lot there, but there is a hookup to China's system. China created the cross-border interbank payment system, another acronym, CIPS, CIPS. Again, that happened in the wake of Crimea when the U.S. Started putting pressure on SWIFT and the sanctions regime against Iran. That has been used. That's strictly with China, and its business strictly done through the renminbi, China's currency. There have been talks, it's unclear how material they are, about Russia hooking up to that system and starting to transact more and more. That would be, and we're going to get into this with the sanctions, a key portion of that. CIPS uses the Swift messaging protocol. So it's the same standards. It is interoperable with Swift. The difference is, and this is critical, it's just the renminbi. So it's renminbi denominated trade. As we get into sanctions, the US's ability to levy sanctions is in large part because the dollar is used for over 90% of global trade. When you start denominating trade in the renminbi and it flows through Chinese banks, you have the ability to circumvent those sanctions.
And this is the key thing for me, and we're seeing this with Visa and MasterCard and Amex turning off services for Russia. There is an alternative. It's Union Pay. Do we see Russia moving away from Western systems to Chinese systems because they're cut off from an access to those Western systems? And if China is less obvious in its cutting off than the West is, do we see just a natural pivot of Russia over to those systems, whether it's CIPS, whether it's Union Pay, and starting to see the global geopolitical sort of landscape bifurcate?
So, and I want to be clear, Stephen. So it's coming to light now, but this trend has been happening for some time. Russia and China, before the official launch of the Ukrainian war, I'm just going to quote from their December meeting between the countries. Particular attention was paid to the need to intensify efforts to form an independent financial infrastructure to service trade operations between Russia and China. Quote, "We mean creating an infrastructure that cannot be influenced by a third party." Yeah, got it. Very clear. By the way, not the only ones. Europe, when the U.S. was pulled out of the nuclear deal with Iran, built their own system. Again, not very robust, very, very clunky for a whole bunch of reasons. But, quote, the reason for existing was, quote, facilitate non-USD and non-SWIFT transactions with Iran to avoid breaking U.S. sanctions. This is The systems have been developed 5, 10 years now with the sole purpose of, in the event that we don't like what the US is doing with sanctions, the fact that the world is still and remains US dollar denominated, the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. How do we build an alternative system? None of them are robust, but we're seeing the kind of the blossomings of them, and they come to light in times of real stress.
And we're at the very, very early stages of what it means to have both these systems, these rails, these connectivity networks, but also perhaps most interesting for me is, as you say, a move towards the US not being that reserve currency, global reserve currency. If that landscape pivots, huge implications for the world order, I think.
Yeah, I would give you a very low probability, very high impact event.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
But we're running that experiment in real time.
We are, and we've seen it run before. I mean, the pound pre World War II was the world's reserve currency, and it shifted over to the dollar. I mean, this has happened throughout history.
So we flirted with pivoting topic and then went backwards.
So let's come back to sanctions, because the reason these are being built is largely due to sanctions. Sanctions, as we said, is quite literally a country saying you can't do business with that entity, with that person. By the way, there's nuance to sanctions. You can say you're allowed to do these types of business, but not those. Even in the event with Iran, humanitarian aid is almost always exempt from sanctions. It's allowed to flow through. The reality of this, though, and what we're seeing, Stephen, as you highlighted with PayPal and Visa and MasterCard and so on, is that if you're a bank or you're a financial institution, and in the event that you screw it up and you allow payment through to someone who's it's not supposed to go to, a type of payment that's not supposed to go through, you're going to get whacked in the head with a 2x4.
Well, there's also the reputational impact. Even if you, and we saw this with Shell over the weekend, even if you are actually able to go buy oil, the world's questioning whether you should or shouldn't. And we're starting to see this bandwagon start of companies that actually can operate in Russia due to the sanctions and the rules decide not to.
Correct. And the last thing you want is to be front page of the Wall Street Journal saying, so facilitated a payment that was then used to purchase arms or what have you. So rather than go rule by rule and say, I can do this type of business, but not that, they'll simply wholesale. There's a formal term for it. It's called de-risking. They will wholesale just cut off and say, I'm not doing any business, full stop. That, needless to say, when you're still trying to 10% of Russia's imports are medical related medicines and packaged medicines and the raw materials to go make them, that basically is going to freeze. Even though that's still allowed under sanctions right now, that trade flow is going to freeze.
Because as I say, I published a list of the 200 companies that operate in Russia this morning. There's a level of transparency and the light is being shined. We talked about some college kid who's tracking Russian boats and Russian oligarchs' planes. There's a level of transparency that's coming, whether that's the mainstream press, whether that's college kids sort of crowdsourcing information. You don't want to be the wrong side of that from a PR perspective.
Absolutely. And mechanically, Stephen, the way this works is, again, 90+% of the world's trade is done in the dollar. If you are transacting with a customer and you guys want to do trade, more often than not, you're going to use the dollar. You're going to go through your banks. More likely than not, those banks don't have a direct relationship with one another. So they're going to go through a third party. They're going to go through perhaps many intermediaries. In the event that those banks do not have a direct relationship and you're doing business in dollars, you can pretty much guarantee one of those banks is going to sit in the U.S.
Well, and they just don't want any part of it.
Correct.
They just don't want any.
Why
would you put yourself in that position?
Right.
Just step back.
Correct. But that's the thing, Stephen, is that even though the U.S. cannot regulate, say, if you're doing business in Mexico, and they're trying to send money to a business with their Mexican bank trying to send money to someone in Russia, even though the U.S. cannot regulate Russia and it cannot regulate Mexico, if they need to move dollars and those dollars come through a U.S. intermediary, yeah, you're going to stop that payment on the spot. It's simply not going to get processed, and that pretty effectively, again, like Swift, can you create another messaging system? Yes, it's clunky and it's tough, but you can do it. Can you create a flow of funds around US intermediaries? Yes, but you're talking now, you've got to go use a different currency and you've got to establish business relationships that you haven't before. And we're talking about taking on credit risk for a bank you don't know that may end up failing. You're not going to do it. So sanctions are a very, very strong way of simply stopping the flow of funds.
Going back to the point I was making earlier, though, if those Russian connections go west today, do we just force those connections over a period of time to go east?
It's the natural outlet.
Mm-hmm.
It's the natural outlet for Russia, at least in an attempt, is to strengthen its relationship with China, assuming China continues to do trade. What the U.S. has done, which is extraordinarily effective, again, we come back to financial warfare. Step one was make it really hard to send messages. Step two is, okay, you can still send payment, but you're not going to be able to do 90% of it because it goes in the dollar. We're going to shut off that channel. The third one, and this comes to the freezing central bank reserves, is we're going to wreck your currency. So even in the event that you do manage to get trade done, let's say you do set up trade channels with China, you're not going to have the money. Your currency is going to be massively devalued, which is going to make any trade you do get done much, much, much more expensive.
And that's the interesting point. The last time I heard the ruble's down 40%, I'm imagining now markets have been open. I've not tracked this morning. It's going to be worse than it was where it was when I last looked at it on Friday. I don't know what the ruble's trading down from where it was, but this is the other key point. I'm trying to remember the numbers now, was it 160 billion of central bank reserves, not in sovereign banks, but in international banks? You probably got
it's more than that, Stephen. So Russia's central bank on the eve of, and they've stopped publishing. So these numbers are kind of a blend between January numbers and March numbers, a little bit from earlier on the gold reserves that we again, that Russia's central bank stopped publicly publishing numbers leading up to this. So on the eve of war, they had about $640 billion in central bank reserves. You can think of that just like you would a normal bank to make life easy. Some of that is actual physical gold that they have within the country, about 130 billion or so. But a lot of that was, hey, we have money stored at the U.S. central bank. We have money stored at the European central bank. We have money stored at other central banks. That's ours. We own it, but we're storing it there.
What? So this was one. Whatever people say about Putin, and it's possible to say everything about the guy right now and not be too wrong. This was well thought through and planned. He didn't make this decision 11 days ago and click his fingers. That troop movement, putting that amount of troops, has taken time and planning and forethought. One question I've got, and maybe I'm channeling it for the listener series. Say there's 400 billion in international banks of that 600 and whatever billion you mentioned. Why wasn't he pulling it out? Because it wouldn't have been hard to see that there would have been sanctions and those reserve assets would have been frozen. If you and I can game theory that out, I'm sure the Russians making this decision, so say you've got 100 billion sitting in the US Fed, why wasn't he taking that out?
Short answer is he was, but I think he probably miscalculated on this front. So we have seen since 2014, the mix of central bank reserves. One, it's, I believe, more than doubled if memory serves, the amount of central bank reserves that the Russian central bank holds. But two, the mix of those has changed dramatically. They've drastically increased the amount of gold. They've brought down the amount of foreign securities that they hold, et cetera, trying to de-risk that balance sheet. But the holdings at foreign central banks, Stephen, we've never had something at the scale. The move by other central banks to freeze the Russian central bank reserves, we have never seen that at this scale. I mean,
Well, we've
what's
never
happening
seen Switzerland pick a side, which is
this is truly unprecedented. I mean, we see right now an argument going on. So the handful of examples we have, the UK refused to release Venezuela's physical gold from the UK. That was one example. Right now there's actually an ongoing court case. Biden has refused to release all of the Afghani central bank reserves stored at the U.S. central bank, given the Taliban takeover. These are, I'm kind of running out of examples here, Stephen. We're talking small, individual, one-on-one countries, isolated events. And instead, Russia is waking up and the entire world, minus China, has frozen their reserves. Stephen, we have never seen anything like this before. It's if not a trump card, it's a tremendously powerful weapon. And just to explain the mechanics quickly, if you are a Russian company and you're doing international trade, again, dollar denominated, you take all of your income, you take all of your expense in rubles. So when you go to trade internationally, you need to go sell rubles and buy dollars in order to transact internationally. Well, that you got enough people doing that, that puts pressure on the ruble, meaning the value is going to fall. Well, somebody else has to come in and buy the ruble so that it maintains its value. And the central bank will often play that role. Well, if you get rid of all the central bank reserves, they quite literally, they don't have the money to buy the ruble. There's nobody.
They're not able to backstop the currency. So if there's no backstop, what happens?
Basically. Exactly. And you've seen a whole bunch of stuff follow on from that Russia's trying to do to stem the pain. They've required that a series of the biggest international companies within Russia sell 80% of their foreign reserves. So in the event that a Russian company is taking in euros or dollars, that they sell those and buy up rubles, trying to create price support. You've seen Russia prohibit money movement internationally. I believe it's low. You can't send more than 10,000 rubles, which is not a lot of money. Internationally, again, trying to limit the loss of again, selling pressure on the ruble. All of these are kind of intermediate measures that'll provide kind of some price support. I believe if you just take the international reserves of the biggest companies, you can make up about 20 to 30% of the buy support the ruble needs on a month-to-month basis, but they'll run out of it in about 2.5 months. So you're looking at kind of Hail Mary type attempts to increase the value of the ruble. The consequence of this is pretty straightforward. If the value of the ruble falls in half, when you go out to buy US dollar denominated stuff or renminbi denominated stuff, if you're doing business with China, you're now spending twice as much. You have to spend quite literally twice as many rubles to purchase the same value good valued in renminbi or dollars or what have you. So taken together, Stephen, you're cut off from a messaging system to move money. You're not allowed to do trade in dollars, which is most of the trade you do. And even the little bit of trade you manage to get through, you're now spending a currency that's worth half as much as it used to be. Everything's twice as expensive. I mean, it's a tremendous arsenal that the world has deployed, that the U.S. has led to pretty much overnight wreck Russia's economy. It's astonishing.
So what are we, 12 days into this now? Wind us forward, if you would. You know, we talked about the end of the month as a particular milestone. Wind us forward, so heaven forbid we're still in this situation 6 months from now. it's a protracted invasion where exactly as we are today on Monday, the 7th of March, is Monday, the 7th of September. I don't know whether that is. My calendar's not up, but let's just assume we've just teleported 6 months into the future and the situation's exactly the same. Unpack what that means. What's been the impact on the Russian economy, the value of the ruble, if nothing's changed militarily on the ground, all of the sanctions and everything that's in place is in place today? What is that potential impact?
The place to start has to be with people. It's always with people. The people hit worst by this are going to be the ones who can least afford it, and that's always true. Financial warfare like this is it can be wildly effective. It can break the will of a people, but the way you do that is by hitting lots and lots and lots of people. These are blunt instruments. These are not targeted instruments. Even when we talk about sanctions against individuals can be targeted, but when you sanction entire companies, when you sanction the largest banks in Russia, I mean that becomes a pretty blunt instrument quite quickly. So the people that can least afford it are going to see the dramatic increase in prices, the lack of access to medicine and normal goods, and so on quite rapidly. Beyond that, Russia can likely be moderately self-sufficient from a kind of baseline economy standpoint. Can they provide food? Can they provide goods? But the vast majority of flow of goods relies on the global economy working, trade flows with foreign countries. If we see a cutoff of oil, I mean, that will make it continue to Russia. If Russia can no longer export gas and oil, again, we'll see that ramp up. This becomes sand in the gears of the Russian economy pretty much overnight. We're not talking about no longer increases in productivity. Stephen, it's reasonable to expect we could see double-digit shrinkage of the Russian economy, and that will manifest as real pain, suffering, and the like for the Russian people.
And we've talked about hyperinflation previously.
It's you're right to bring it up. It's the only kind of short term. So Russia will likely go after two different ways of trying to solve this problem. One we've hit on is increased trade with China, try and replace those trade flows globally with trade with China. China, for instance, could lend against the gold that is physically within Russia without moving that gold to give them RMB. That RMB could then be spent to go do other stuff. So Russia, that may provide an outlet. And I'm sure we will see them attempt it. The other way, which is short term, might help a little, and long term, wildly destructive, is just turn on the money printing machine. If your rubles are worth half as much, print twice as many rubles. Well, that becomes a death spiral very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not just the value of the ruble declines as you increase the printing. That moves inflation expectations. And we've talked about this previously. If everybody who's going to accept the ruble expects the ruble to be devalued, they're proactively going to increase the amount of rubles they require. So even if the money supply is only doubled, you may go to the store and find out that a loaf of bread, the price is tripled in anticipation of the next round of money printing. That becomes a death spiral. That is really, really, really hard to undo.
It's a spiral. Because, as you say, people's perception changes. I'll go spend my money now. Behaviors change. I'll go spend my money now because I think it's going to be worth less tomorrow. Hoarding, supply constraints, people doing unusual acts to avoid future pain.
And the pain from this, Stephen, if Ukraine wins tomorrow, and let's assume that all of the sanctions let's just make up a scenario, all the sanctions were rolled back, SWIFT is turned back on, central bank reserves are unfrozen. The collateral damage that's being done from financial warfare against the Russian economy is going to take months, if not years, to fully work itself out. You don't just turn it back on. Everybody, you've now shifted expectations where say, well, the country could get cut off again. It could decide to go invade Poland or what have you. Everyone is going to be very tentative. Oh, they could devalue the ruble again. This damage is going to be very, very, very long lasting. I mean, what Putin has done to his people is horrendous, and we're only just beginning to see the tip of the iceberg of the damage that's it's going to play out over a generation.
So we're way past time, but I'm not going to do my usual role of trying to curtail the conversation because I think this is a huge topic. One of the final things we want to talk about: what can we do? I've personally started a GoFundMe to put money into an account of a personal friend of mine who's currently bankrolling 6 families in Poland who've had to flee Kiev. Sorry. Um, I understand that from conversations with him, just purely tactical. I felt compelled over the weekend to do something. I didn't want to sit there and use my platforms to opine. I actually wanted to do something material. What can we be doing? We talked about this before we came on the pod here. What's the personal thing that we can be doing? I mean, obviously, I've set this GoFundMe page up. Other people are doing other things, which obviously I applaud. But what can we be doing?
Stephen, I applaud what you're doing. It's phenomenal, and I applaud. I'm sure what are the many efforts of our listeners. I will put a note of caution in here. Anytime you're donating money, um, do the due diligence that the place you're giving it to is appropriately dispersing those funds. There are a lot of people doing a tremendous amount of good right now to help in the situation. But with the amount of money flowing into Ukraine, we're also seeing, as is expected, an enormous explosion in fraud of people trying to divert those funds for their own nefarious purposes. So just be careful, do your due diligence. When in doubt, go with a well-established nonprofit fund, the like, that's done this before, that has a track record of doing good, that has a track record of dispersing funds appropriately.
That was my personal concern, and that was why. And I'm not trying to advertise for my GoFundMe, but I know my friend is on the front line. I know he's particularly bankrolling this, so I wanted to circumvent that due diligence and just get funds directly to him. I can't stress enough, and to echo Jared's point, do your there. The world is a horrible place. People profit from horrible situations. Do the work to do your due diligence on the particular charities that you're investing in.
Another small way folks can make a difference, and it's one that I highlighted in the letter because it hit close to home for me. I had a run-in with one of the Russian oligarchs, Vladimir Potanin, a number of years ago. Unfortunately, I tried to shut down a previous employer I was at. I tried to shut down a business engagement with Vladimir, and shortly after I left the employer to launch a startup, they nonetheless moved ahead and did business with him. To put Potanin in context, I think this is really, really helpful. Potanin is unsanctionable. That doesn't mean he is any. That doesn't mean he is any bit less bad than the people that are being sanctioned. It happens to be that he well positioned himself so that effectively he can't be sanctioned. He is the largest owner and functionally the controller of a company called Nornickel. When I put Potanin into context, we could have this conversation about any one of the oligarchs in Russia. I happen to know this one reasonably well. Potanin is the architect behind the USSR's Loan for Shares program. If you're unfamiliar with that, look up the history. That is in the early 90s as Russia, Soviet Union was transitioning to become Russia. That is how the state-owned enterprises were chopped up and just handed off pure corruption for pennies on the dollars to political favorites. Potanin was not only the architect of that program, he was the banker who designed the program. He then moved into government and took a company called Nornickel as his prize, left government, and has run it ever since. He is the richest man in Russia today. Nornickel mines nickel, palladium, and a series of other things. They mine about 15% of the world's nickel supply. They mine about I believe it's 50% of the world's palladium supply. Nickel, specifically grade A nickel, which is what Nornickel creates, is a key ingredient in car batteries. Palladium, 85% of the world's palladium is used in the exhaust pipes to stop all the nasty stuff going out the exhaust. So it turns into water and CO2. If you sanction Nornickel, if you sanction Potanin, the car industry grinds to a halt overnight. So he is effectively unsanctionable. Nonetheless, Nornickel's track record, it used to be part of the Gulag system. As of last year, they were still producing 2% of the world's sulfur dioxide. That's 20, to put equivalent, that's 20% of what the US produces as an entire country a year. Sulfur dioxide is the reason that we have acid rain. A couple of years ago, he dumped thousands, millions of gallons of diesel all over the Arctic. This is a company that has one of the worst environmental track records on Earth. Their business is open pit mines and dumping stuff into the Arctic. And yet this man is unsanctionable. Well, that doesn't mean you can't do anything. So Potanin, until very recently, and I'm happy to have played, I think, a small role in this. Potanin, until very recently, sat on the board of the Guggenheim Museum, the Guggenheim Foundation, which is behind the Guggenheim Museum in New York. It's a world-renowned art museum. Art historically has been used to move money around the world when otherwise it would be sanctioned or not available to do so. One of the ways that oligarchs manage to get their money out from where they are and to increase the value is that they go sit on the board of an art museum like Guggenheim. They then go up and buy up a huge portfolio of little known art or well-known art. They go do a showing at a well-known museum, perhaps one they're on the board of, and then they go and sell the art for lots more money. And if there's any question about where Potanin fits in the world, his relationship to the government, in 2005, right after he joined the board of the Guggenheim, he launched an exhibition at Guggenheim called Russia! And none other than Vladimir Putin was the keynote speaker for the launch of the event. Potanin has now been kicked off the board of the Guggenheim. What that means is, it doesn't make a big difference. The guy's worth $10 billion. This is a small difference. But you've shut off one of the avenues that he can use to enrich himself when most of his money has come at the expense of environmental degradation, the Russian people, the functioning of the economy. It's made a small but meaningful impact in managing to effectively sanction a man who's unsanctionable. You can go look for other examples. Until very recently, the Brooklyn Nets, NBA team here in New York, was owned by a Russian oligarch. Abramovich owns Chelsea, the football club in Europe. Go take a look. I think it was the New York Times just ran an article on all the movie directors that have been taking Russian money for years and years and years and years. We as individuals have the ability. Go bang on the doors of the Guggenheim and tell them to knock them off. Go stop going to the Chelsea game, stop buying the gear until they wash their hands of the source of money. Stop going to a movie that is funded by a Russian oligarch. You can hit them in their pocketbooks. You can play a meaningful role. You can actually make a difference so that they understand that their actions have consequences, so that folks in the US, folks in the free and democratic world, when they're thinking about taking money, actually do the due diligence and understand that not all money is made equal.
And I think this is the other dimension, and the final topic we want to get onto in the next sort of 3 or 4 minutes is multi-domain operations. We have a source of information and a level of information exposure and the ability to share information. We talked about before we jumped on the pod of some college kid who's now tracking Russian oligarchs playing tail signs. This information is publicly available now. What there wasn't prior to maybe the last 10 years was the ability to share that information at scale instantly. The social networks have given us the ability for anybody with a Twitter connection and the ability to write a few lines of code to pull this data together and aggregate it to be able to share that with the world. I think exposing yourself to these new information flows and being aware those airports will run commercial operations. Being able to, choose where you put your trade and where you put your dollars is vital. So I hinted there at multi-domain operations. I'm conscious we're 49 minutes in of what we try and keep to a normal half an hour podcast. So I'm going to let us run a little longer and maybe give us another 5-6 minutes here, Jared. We talked about multi-domain operations before we came onto the podcast. I think you hinted at it in some of your communications around the newsletter. I think I'd like to go there and talk about how we talked about financial warfare. I've just brought us onto social media. Talk about what you are using as a frame of reference here and a framework for what you're calling not what you're calling, what people are calling multi-domain operations.
So to be clear, I'm a little outside my what I'd call my normal zone of competence here. The financial warfare piece, for listeners' benefit, I've built and helped implement anti-money laundering and know your customer systems. I've worked with central banks around the world, so relatively comfortable domain there. Multi-domain operations is a term of art, I believe coined, but certainly popularized by the U.S. Army to discuss, and it's now a formal strategy that they've written at length about and implemented, talking about how do you wage modern warfare. And the focus there, and I'm going to read a couple of quotes in a moment that'll do a better job than I ever could. But the focus there is if you go back in history, you kind of had isolated domains of war. You had land, you had the Army would compete, you had the Navy over water, you had increasingly in World War II, you had air. And there became a realization post World War II, but really kind of ramped up in the last decade or so, that these things are much more powerful combined together than they ever are operating independently. And the fact that the Navy can support a land operation, the fact that air support can come in and clear ground, but it goes well beyond that. Russia understood this with Crimea. They waged a painfully effective social media war well in advance of ever putting troops on the ground in Crimea, where they they misdirected attention, where they instilled a sense of fear, a sense of the unknown. And then when they put troops down on the ground, they took their insignias off. So yeah, the whole world, endless reports that it's Russian soldiers, but Russian could plausibly deny that it was their soldiers because it didn't come with their badges. That is a painful, painful example of what did it mean to combine a cyber war. They took a whole bunch of banks and government offices offline, with a social media war, with misinformation, with land troops. And the U.S., to its credit, has been a leader in designing this, and it's part of financial warfare is a new domain alongside cyber, alongside land, to effectively wage war against adversaries. What makes cyber interesting, what makes social media interesting, financial warfare, is these, and please do view, these are weapons of war like anything else, but they involve a much broader swath of people. This is not the military GI Joe as we think of it in normal terms. This is a much broader group. This is the general public and those whose interests are aligned in maintaining the free world and the world order, working together to effect an end. And in that light, I'm going to read a couple of quotes that I think nails this. The first couple comes from a 2013 book called Treasury War, which comes from one of the officials that worked in the U.S. Treasury, where we saw version 1 of financial war against Iran and Syria. And then the second, I'm actually from a retired U.S. 4-star general when he was still in service, Robert Browns. So first couple quotes from 2013's Treasury's War. What made this type of financial warfare different from and more effective than traditional sanctions was that we harnessed the private sector's own interests and calculus to isolate rogue financial actors. Power and influence now often lie outside the classic state structures. The state remains relevant, but more than ever before, The global power landscape is shared with other actors and networks. I want to set that as baseline here. What the author is talking about there is not government run military. What they're talking about is the discussion that we've had here. SWIFT is an independent organization, and yet it's helping wage war. Sanctions, the US government can make them, but it's the banks that actually cut people off. The central banks, again, when we talk about a tax on the ruble, the fact that folks won't do business with Russia and won't buy up rubles anymore, this is the private sector aligning its interests with US interests to help wage war.
And it's personal sanctions on oligarchs and their influence on Putin and strategy and execution. It's hitting at all sides on that, all stakeholders all at once from multiple sides.
The little bit we're talking about doing that makes a difference about making it publicly known that Potanin was on the board of Guggenheim so that they boot him off. That is a weapon. It's a small one, but it does play a role. It plays a meaningful difference. The last couple quotes here as we wrap comes from retired U.S. four-star General Robert Brown, and we'll link to the video this comes from. He does a lengthy interview on multi-domain operations, and I pulled out a couple of key quotes that I think helped level set here. Multi-domain operations. It's the way of the future and in warfare. You've got all the domains, and I think around them is this human domain. That is the most complex, the most important. If you truly work together, it allows you to present multiple dilemmas to an adversary. So you're pairing up, maneuvering to a position of relative advantage, and each domain working together to create those windows of opportunity where you can dominate your adversary. We're not going to do anything alone, but if we come together and we truly get multi-domain operations right, it'll be an absolute key to peace and stability in the future. And some of these nations, many out there, they don't have the people, the ability to empower people the way we do. That is a huge advantage. It has been for a long time. I sure wouldn't want to go up against us when we do it right.
I don't think I've got a better way to end the call here, Jared, than that quote. Thank you for listening to the Fat Tailed Thoughts podcast. Tough topic. Our thoughts and prayers and hopes go out for the people of Ukraine. Thank you for listening. We'll speak to you next week.